It's the deepening scandal at the BBC surrounding one of its highest paid presenters. Two more people have now accused the star of sending them inappropriate messages, with allegations that he broke COVID rules to meet a 23-year-old and sent messages including heart emojis and kisses to a 17-year-old on Instagram. And among the growing calls for him to be identified this morning, another presenter at the corporation, Jeremy Vine, urged him to come forward to protect his colleagues.
It's his decision, but he needs to come forward now, I think. I know his survival instinct has kicked in, and I know he saw what happened to Philip Schofield, but my God, look at the damage to the BBC. Look at the damage to his friends, to those falsely accused, and the longer he leaves it, the worse it will be for him.
Joining me again from outside the BBC in London is TalkTV correspondent Oliver Whitfield-Mirchich. Hello, Oliver. You've been there for some days now, and every day the story deepens and grows wider, more emotional. People get more upset. One of those people, the well-known presenter Jeremy Vine, who's saying it's enough. It's enough. This person must reveal his identity and must do it speedily.
Yes, and we've heard that call now for 2 days, because yesterday he took to his Twitter account to say pretty much the same, saying he thought long and hard about putting out that tweet in question, but he believes that it is the right thing to do. The thing you've got to remember with Jeremy Vine is that he was one of the presenters who was falsely labelled as being the other BBC presenter at the centre of these allegations. He has threatened legal action against people online for making those defamatory posts, because it's not just the media who are concerned around defamatory publications which could lead to other people thinking less of somebody who's being targeted. It also applies to everybody who is writing on social media. Now, earlier on, we caught up with Jeremy Vine as he was leaving his Radio 2 show. We asked him whether he was still thinking of pursuing legal claims against people on the World Wide Web. He wouldn't give us an answer on that. He said he would get back to us later. We've also put the claims to him, though, from some of his former colleagues, including Richard Bacon, who's urged Vine to stop it. He says that he's more emotionally intelligent than this, and that he'll be able to survive having people mislabel him as the BBC presenter for 5 minutes of his life. He believes that the BBC presenter at the centre of the allegations does not need to identify himself. And so we put the allegations to Jeremy Vine saying, are you acting in a selfish way so that you don't face further defamatory allegations? He did not wish to comment. But it's not just it's not just journalists who are getting themselves into an argument about what the next steps should be. Politicians can't agree on it either. The Conservative Dame Andrea Leadsom believes that this BBC star should identify himself. Other politicians from other political parties say that should not be the case. All the while, the BBC finds itself again in a huge crisis. There are still questions outstanding for the BBC, such as what were the differences in the complaints that came about? Why did it take so long to get in touch with the presenter? Why were there only 2 attempts made to try and get in touch with the original young person's parents who made the first complaints? Now, the BBC yesterday saying it will review its policies and see whether complaints are flagged high enough, but we have put specific questions to the BBC, and so far none of them have been answered over the past 48 hours. We've repeatedly asked for a sit-down interview with BBC top executives, tried to find out when they knew this information, give us any more details, but the BBC is refusing those requests. This is a story which has divided not only journalists, not only politicians, but the public at large. Some believe that the way that The Sun has reported the story is not correct. The Sun newspaper, though, standing by its reporting in a new editorial today, saying the reason it was right to report it is because it believes there was a misabuse of potential power. So, look, the story is not going away. potentially there will be more allegations which come to light later on. At the moment, everybody is waiting to see whether this presenter does identify himself, whether a politician identifies himself, or potentially if there'll be some movement by the police and whether they will launch a formal investigation.
And certainly the story deepens and unfolds, Oliver, doesn't it? First of all, there was the story of this one young person, and the question hovering over the whole story was, could that person have been only 17 when erotic photographs were asked for, paid for and exchanged? And if that person was only 17, then this was a criminal offence. Then there was the letter from this young person's lawyer saying this is complete rubbish and nonsense. Then the Sun doubled down on the story, saying we're not giving up on this. The parents came to us, they're bona fide, we've seen evidence, we're pursuing it. Then the BBC presented us with another young person who said that there'd been threatening messages from this particular individual. But since then, I'm looking at the front page of The Sun today, BBC Star broke lockdown to meet another young stranger, and there's even another young person involved. So maybe you'll just fill us in on those two latest young people.
Yes, so the first story, which was published by The Sun yesterday, first appearing online at around 8 or 9 o'clock, was the allegation that a 23-year-old man had been contacted by the BBC Star in question over a period of 3 months. Relentless messages were sent back, even though at the time the country was in a lockdown. The BBC Star allegedly willing to break that lockdown to go and visit him, which he then went and did in February of 2021. Those restrictions at the time meant that you weren't allowed to travel unless for work purposes. We were then told that the BBC Star allegedly paid up to £650 to this young person. The young person sent back a semi-naked picture. Now, in a separate story from The Sun, it alleges that a 17-year-old who was still a pupil at school was contacted in October 2018, completely out of the blue, on Instagram. Those messages that were sent including love heart emojis and kisses at the end of messages. The then 17-year-old, the person who was 17, saying that the reason he is speaking out to The Sun is so that others who potentially have been contacted may come forward. Now, there is no insinuation in this fourth now young person to have come forward that anything illegal has happened. These were messages on a social media website. But the reason that we're reporting them is to show the pattern of communication that we've seen across all four of these young people who have come forward. And that is that they've been contacted on social media, on dating sites, and then in some cases those messages have been abusive. So that's where we stand in terms of the allegations that have been put forward, the number of people that have come forward to speak to not only The Sun, but also to the BBC's own news service.
Oliver, thank you very much indeed. Joining me now is media law consultant Ian Bloom. Ian, thanks so much for your company this afternoon. So you will be able to explain better than so many others why there is this issue of privacy and why someone like Andrea Leadsom saying, you know, it's enough, we need to know, let's lance the boil, let the lid off and all this kind of thing may well not fly. So explain who is owed privacy and why.
Well, good afternoon, Vanessa. Perhaps the starting point is to say this, that there have so far been a lot of lurid allegations, and as Oliver said, no evidence of crime has been produced, either by The Sun or anyone else. And in those circumstances, the presumption of innocence and the reasonable expectation of privacy that everybody enjoys until they're arrested and charged with an offence, when they can then be named, that prevails. That's the law. The Supreme Court has said so. It trumps any argument that freedom of speech entitles us to know, because it, quite frankly, it doesn't. That's perhaps the legal starting point. Then we come on to why should there be pressure on this presenter to out himself Well, clearly the BBC is not going to do so. It would be, to my mind, a disgrace if a backbench politician used the privilege of speaking in Parliament in the House of Commons to give the name. It's what happened in the Ryan Giggs case some years ago, and it was wrong then, it would be wrong now. And it would also be a shame if the social media storm resulted in a paper or other mainstream media outlet naming the individual. That isn't the way to go about it. The way to go about it is to allow a proper investigation to take place. The BBC, I think, can be rightly criticised for being too slow to respond to the first report it received. Their problem is almost one of admin overload. I understand that they had about 250 complaints about their staff in the last 6 months, nearly 2 a day. That's a lot to get through. And perhaps they didn't pay sufficient attention to this one because there was apparently no allegation of criminal activity. There was just the desire, it seems, to have the presenter stop making payments. And if it got lost, then the BBC can, and rightly, review its procedures to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen again. But it's a long way to saying, because of that, we're now entitled to know the name before a proper investigation has taken place. And if the police are doing so, then let them get on with it. They are not in the business, and nor should they be, of offering a running commentary on a daily basis to feed a news agenda eager for gossip.
But Ian, is there not another dimension to this? Yes, there's a possibility of the law having been broken, a charge being made, etc. But there's also a situation whereby a senior BBC presenter, having behaved in a way that is not, it turns out, maybe, possibly illegal, but in the view of the licence fee payer and those viewers watching, immoral or unpalatable, may find, or the BBC may find, that this is an obstacle to that person doing his or her job, because the knowledge of their proclivities, although if this person were a geography teacher or a dry cleaner, nobody would need to know, nobody would have to know, it'd be none of their business at all. But if this has come to light in this way, and people are therefore aware of this, it might stand in the way of their simply responding to what this particular employee of the BBC does for a living. It would impede their ability to do their job and also bring the BBC into some kind of disrepute, impugn the reputation of the BBC, because it would be seen not to be illegal, but immoral, unattractive, unappealing, unpalatable. And so if there's that dimension too going on here, I believe, and I've been speaking to employment lawyers all week about this, that employment law is an altogether different animal. And in employment law, actually, there isn't a burden of proof at all, that the organisation itself can say this employee is bringing us into disrepute, defaming us. And actually, Tim Davies already said that the reputation of the BBC is suffering because of this. And therefore, could it not, or would it not be possible or even likely for the BBC to say, look, whether the law's been broken or not, that's a whole different thing. That's up to the police. But from our point of view, this individual can no longer fulfil the brief to do the job that he or she is meant to do. And so therefore, we have to A, get rid of them, and B, say who they are and why we're doing it. That kind of a thing.
It's a very good point, and you put it as well as I think anyone can. The problem is, until there has been a decent and fair analysis and investigation into what happened, even that process means you can't summarily dismiss on the basis of unproven allegations. There's got to be fairness. Employment law requires fairness. A procedural fairness, as well as the outcome being fair based on the evidence in front of it. So you're quite right. This presenter seems to me to be perhaps terminally damaged in terms of future employment, indeed current employment. But that doesn't mean that he should now be summarily dismissed without the opportunity within the BBC or by the police to explain what went on, how and why.
One more question for you, Ian, if you don't mind. It was revealed yesterday that the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, had not spoken to, met with, or questioned this particular highly paid and well-known employee. I think
Yeah.
the implication was supposed to be that this would somehow impugn privacy or fairness or something or other. But I think most people, including me, who heard this were absolutely astonished, because I think we all thought that if you're at the helm of an organisation or the Director General de facto, you're the boss of the whole thing, and there's a problem with a member of staff. And even if there's not, it's absolutely appropriate and completely falls within your remit to ask that person to come and see you in your office, or to meet that person for coffee or whatever it is, and to say, listen, old chap, is it true or isn't it true? So at least we know what we're dealing with here. Would there have been some kind of infringement of this person's human rights or employment rights or any old rights if the Director General had said, come and talk to me about this? I want to know, did you or didn't you?
Well, I think the BBC employment procedures are more complex than come and have a cup of tea and tell me what you've done wrong.
But do they need to be? Should they be more complex?
Employment law. I have been an employment lawyer as well in the past. Employment law has codes that govern how you have disciplinary procedures. You probably have one yourself on Talk. All employees now most employees in big organizations are subject to the employment regulations that govern their employment, and they include usually quite lengthy procedures for suspending someone, for dismissing them.
Well, what about though, Ian? Sorry to interrupt, but what about the bit pre that, where you're not suspending anyone, you're not disciplining anyone, you're just saying, mate, come and chat, just want to know, is there anything going on here? Is there something that we might need to start implementing the protocol of whatever the flipping protocol is, you know, in clause 87 on page 532? Just come quickly for a donut and tell me whether there's something I should be worried about. I once overheard Ali G, Sacha Baron Cohen, on the phone. We were both in Italy. He was on the phone and he was saying to the fellow at the other end, tell me, should I be worried or should you be worried? Should I worry or should you worry? I couldn't help overhearing this. I loved the conversation. Am I worrying or are you worrying? Okay, you're worrying. Thank you. Goodbye. I mean, couldn't Tim Davie have had a conversation like that? Should I be worried? Should I be worried or shouldn't I be worried? And if I'm worried, I'll start the proceedings. If I'm not worried, enjoy the donut. Let's have a coffee. That kind of a thing, the human kind of a thing.
I appreciate the attempt to reenact the employment, but I don't think when you've got over 20,000 employees, however important some of them are, may think they are, you can operate a fair employment procedure on the basis of come and have a cup of coffee and tell me what you've done wrong. It is more difficult. It may have prejudiced a proper inquiry by having even that chat. Right. He would have been advised by his HR people, by his legal team. You distance yourself and rely on the people whose job it is to investigate this. We've got good people here. Maybe they took their eye off the ball initially, but they are the ones to deal with this. You've got to stay above the fray. You could be almost the appellate court within the BBC, so you shouldn't get involved in dealing with it at that come and have a cup of coffee and a donut, even with sugar on top, to discuss.
Even with jam on it. Ian, I appreciate that, and I'm sure you're absolutely right. I defer, of course, to your expertise, but isn't it a hell of a shame that you couldn't? Thank you so much for joining me. Come and join me for a donut anytime.